By US standards, most European houses are small. In fact, the bottom income quintile in the United States enjoys the same amount of living space as the average European. And while this revelation is likely nothing groundbreaking if you've been following my channel for any amount of time, there is a butterfly effect to this architectural juxtaposition that I don't think we often talk about. In most European communities, there are many public spaces: plazas, piazzas, parks, libraries, playgrounds, athletic fields, markets, marinas, and street-side cafes. And as a consequence, life is lived in the streets. The streets are where children play, it's where pedestrians commute, it's where we entertain others and ourselves. But in contrast, in North America, houses are bigger, people have more land, and as a consequence, life, more than ever, is lived at home and in isolation. Parks, community centers, libraries, even playgrounds are in decline. And it's tearing us apart in ways that we don't even see. So, let's actually take a look. According to a recent Pew Research Center survey, the majority of Americans, 57%, say that they would prefer to live in a community where houses are larger and further apart. But schools, stores, and restaurants are several miles away. And this statistic tracks pretty well with how I also have seen my hometown community change. Every time I go back to the United States, there is a newer, bigger neighborhood popping up on the edge of town. 3-car garages are now just as, if not more so, common than 2. A single-car garage is practically unheard of in new construction today. And even homes marketed as starter homes feature amenities like master suites, swimming pools, and home theaters. They are big, and a good many of them are actually really quite beautiful. But they are desperately far away from the very amenities that make their communities vibrant, attractive, and connected. Seeing houses like this reminds me of how central the problem of competitive consumption is, and how it lies at the root of the United States' systemic disinvestment in social infrastructure. Face-to-face socializing has plummeted this century, especially for young people. Nobody parties anymore, and we spend more time in our homes than in any other period on record. And when looking at the data, it is clear that the pandemic had a massive effect on the amount of time we spent at home. Time spent on out-of-home activities fell by over an hour per day on average, from 332 minutes in 2019 to 271 minutes in 2021. But to be fair, the writing was on the walls well beforehand, as we had been experiencing a steady decline in out-of-home activities in the 2 decades leading up to the pandemic. Compared with 2003, Americans in 2019 spent nearly 30 minutes less per day on out-of-home activities. And there are many reasons for this shift, but advances in technology, whether it's smartphones, streaming services, or social media, all of these contribute to it. You can video chat with a friend rather than meeting them in person for coffee. You can order groceries through an app instead of venturing into the supermarket, and stream a movie instead of seeing it in the theater. Yet, while time spent outside of the home has rebounded since the pandemic, it has done so only slightly. On the whole, Americans spend nearly 1.5 hours less outside their homes in 2023 than they did in 2003. To compensate for this lack of time in the public space, private space has become more luxurious and as large as possible. Plus, over the past century, the median new home build has more than doubled in size, from just over 1,000 square feet to nearly 2,500 square feet. Yet, as US homes have ballooned in size, the median number of inhabitants per single-family home has decreased from 4.3 to 2.5 people. In other words, all of that extra space isn't necessarily being built to make room for more people, but instead to cater to the needs once serviced by the public social infrastructure. Middle-class Americans specifically have shifted from public activities like movie theaters to home-based entertainment, and from municipal pools to backyard pools. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself here, so let's explore a little more deeply what I mean when I say social infrastructure.
We don't need palaces. The ideas are what shine in our meetings.
What are you, some kind of moron? Why don't you have hand dryers in the park bathrooms?
For starters, there are many different kinds of social infrastructure. Sociologist Eric Kleinenberg uses social infrastructure to describe the physical places and organizations that shape how we interact with one another. Schools, libraries, parks, playgrounds, rec centers, sidewalks, community gardens. On some level, these can simply just be spaces where strangers become neighbors. But nonprofit organizations like churches, for example, also act as social infrastructure when they have an established physical space where people can assemble, like regularly scheduled markets for food and clothing. And commercial establishments like cafes, diners, barbershops, and bookstores can also count as social infrastructure. And these spaces are incredibly important to our well-being. People forge ties in places that have healthy social infrastructures, not necessarily because they set out to build community, but because when people engage in sustained, recurrent interactions, relationships grow. But sadly, in the United States, these lifelines are vastly underfunded and, in some cases, disappearing entirely. The classic American Main Street, a walkable commercial center with a mix of services, public spaces, and locally owned businesses, has struggled for decades. That much is not new, but research is showing that other types of third places are on the decline as well. Take public parks as a prime example. To campaign for new parks, at least in the United States, is to risk appearing ridiculous. In fact, we made an entire hit TV series about it. A long-running US TV sitcom, Parks and Recreation, was set in a Midwest city not all that unlike my hometown. Leslie fought to turn a derelict site into public green space and was in turn serially frustrated, not least by her boss, a libertarian who wanted to abolish local government despite working for it.
I like saying no. It lowers their enthusiasm.
Sadly, parks are public policy Cinderellas, and new parks and new forms of other social infrastructure are a rarity in the United States. You see, unlike transportation or utilities, public space is often not treated as infrastructure and thus receives fragmented or inconsistent funding. Federal infrastructure bills like the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law devoted massive sums to road, transit, and broadband, but relatively little to parks and civic spaces. In the United States, local governments provide the vast majority of funds. A 2022 report indicates that nearly 75% of park funding comes from municipal governments, though this funding is often susceptible to cuts in public spending. Because it is deemed non-essential, parks are often the first to be affected by fiscal constraints and the last to be reinstated. And there are often significant differences in the quality, size, and accessibility of the parks in wealthy communities versus those in less affluent areas. If you look at most major American cities, you see pretty extreme segregation between wealthy communities and poor communities. Wealthy people tend to live in places where they could have big gated houses and their own swimming pool and their own private park. In contrast, lower income and even some middle-class families find themselves living in places where there aren't enough trees and there aren't enough public spaces. And again, when there are such spaces available, they're often in fiscal retrenchment due to declining or stagnating sales and property tax revenues. Just take a look at this phenomenon called the Delmar Divide. In St. Louis, Missouri, Delmar Boulevard cuts through the city from east to west, and while the laws and covenants that once physically and legally divided the city no longer remain, the street still reflects stark differences in racial makeup and socioeconomic inequity that exists immediately north and south of it. And we can also see this in the legacy of green spaces that exist in these historic neighborhoods. South of Delmar, in the wealthier neighborhood, is Forest Park, home to the St. Louis Zoo, a history museum, a golf course, and an ice skating rink. North of Delmar Boulevard is Sherman Park, the largest park in the area, which has nowhere close to the same amenities and poor maintenance. Now, you might argue that investments in parks north of Delmar aren't necessary. There is nothing stopping someone who lives above the Delmar Divide from going to Forest Park today. But let me explain why I tend to disagree. Despite the well-documented benefits of parks, 100 million people in the United States, including 28 million children, do not have close-to-home parks, defined as the 10-minute walk. And in cities like St. Louis, low-income families experience inequities in park quality, acreage, and safety, with residents facing barriers such as poor perceptions of safety, inadequate infrastructure for non-motorized access, and a historical legacy of unwelcoming park experiences for Black and African American people. These factors create significant obstacles to the equitable use of parks for recreation and health benefits, especially in low-income neighborhoods. And listen, if you love getting outside, you know there is a big difference between a park down the street and one across town. If a trip to the park means waiting for the bus or packing up the family into the car and sitting in traffic, all of those other options start to sound more appealing. But having green spaces in your neighborhood opens up possibilities. A quick jog before work, a picnic lunch break, or even sending older kids out to play on their own after school. For park planners, that convenience factor matters. Easy access to green space contributes to the quality of life that is key to cities attracting and keeping residents and businesses. Plus, it's a public health issue. Research has shown that people who regularly use parks get more and better exercise than people who don't. Take, for example, where I currently live in Germany. Despite living in much more urban and densely populated areas, nearly 93% of the population has access to green space here within 500 meters of their place of residence, about a 5 to 6 minute walk. And in major German cities, the statistics are actually better. Spatial analysis shows that on average, an individual in a German major city lives in a distance of just 183 meters from a green space or a park. That's a 2 to 2.5 minute walk. And people here experience significantly better health outcomes. Yet, despite being one of the few things that nearly everyone along the political divide agrees upon, building social infrastructure like parks, green belts, and trails is actually kind of difficult to do today. For starters, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when many of the iconic city and national parks were established, land near cities was cheaper and more plentiful. New York City, for example, used eminent domain to seize 843 acres of land north of the developed city to create what we know today as Central Park. Back then, the city paid around $7.4 million, equivalent to a few hundred million today, to buy that land, which is a steal in quite the literal sense of the term, because the compensation was undervalued and insufficient, especially for long-term minority residents who lost their homes, community, and stability. It's actually estimated that Central Park today is worth somewhere around $2 trillion in land value alone. But fast forward to today, urban land is often already developed, highly valuable, and very expensive to acquire for, quote, non-revenue generating purposes like parks. And that phrase, non-revenue generating purposes, is sadly really important because parks don't really generate as much tax revenue as other land uses, making them harder to justify politically. And local governments face competing demands for housing, commercial space, and infrastructure, which often takes priority over dedicating land to parks, for example. Plus, today, urban development is more fragmented and almost exclusively driven by private developers and short-term economic incentives, making it harder to set aside large public spaces. Consider the case of San Francisco's Mission Bay neighborhood. Once an industrial area, it was redeveloped over the last few decades, largely through private investment. The result is a beautiful, dense mix of housing, offices, and biotech labs, but with relatively limited open public land compared to the scale of this development. Much of the green space that does exist is fragmented into small parks or waterfront strips, rather than a large, continuous civic space. It's a missed opportunity to create something on the scale of the Golden Gate Park, which was set aside in the late 1800s when long-term public planning still shaped the city's growth. In essence, developers and investors gravitate towards infrastructure with clear revenue models, like toll roads or transit systems. Not essential but unprofitable public utilities and public social infrastructure. But even if you expand beyond parks, whether it's a museum, a library, a market square, or a community center, for example, the biggest barrier, in my opinion, is that the United States is extraordinarily driven by the "what's in it for me" mentality. You will frequently hear Americans say things like, "Why should I pay for a school my kid doesn't go to?" Or "Why should I pay for a road I don't drive on?" Or "Why should I pay for a park that I won't visit?" And library funding, for example, often requires voter-approved bonds or levies, which can fail if taxpayers are skeptical. And some communities also politicize libraries, like debates over book content, programming, or who uses the space, which can make new projects controversial. In the past, public consensus strongly supported public spaces like libraries because they were viewed as engines of democracy. But today's prevailing neoliberal political and economic ideology advocates for free market capitalism, with minimal government intervention, promoting economic freedom and private property. As governments stepped back, private companies filled in the gaps. Gyms replaced public recreation centers. Private daycares replaced neighborhood childcare programs. Malls replaced downtown civic squares. And those big McMansions that I showed at the start of the video? Well, to a degree, it's an extension of the same phenomenon. Private spaces today include more of the amenities that were once serviced by the public domain. But America's social infrastructure didn't crumble overnight, and it won't be rebuilt overnight. But every town that funds parks instead of parkways proves that this is fixable. So please share this video if you believe strong communities start with places where people belong. And tell me down below in the comments, what's one space in your hometown that, if fixed, would reconnect people? And if you're a librarian, parks and recreation worker, civic planner, or a volunteer, thank you. You are the builders of America's social glue. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So I'll see you next time. Cheers!